Hello, good morning. I'm Julian Brooks, Senior Curator of Drawings at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this panel discussion, Learning to Draw, Then and Now. And I say good morning, but it may be evening or afternoon with you. But anyway, thank you for being here. And I'm thrilled to have the panel that we have today, and I'd like to just briefly introduce them to you. So we have Katrin Bellinger, who's a former art dealer and collector of drawings of artists at work, several of which are featured in the Learning to Draw exhibition. And then Anne Bermingham, Professor Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara. She is author of Learning to Draw, Studies in the Cultural History of a Polite and Useful Art in 2000, a groundbreaking book that remains a pivotal study of women artists and drawing. And finally, Harry Parker, principal of the Royal Drawing School, is a painter and writer whose work draws on his experiences in the British Army. He studied art and art history, and his debut novel, Anatomy of a Soldier, was published in 2016. So yes, welcome to the panelists. Thank you for being here. I'll just share my screen now. There we go. You can see that. And just to let you know, where are we? There we go. So this, the panel is on the, we put it together on the occasion of this exhibition, Learning to Draw, which opened last week at the Getty and runs until January the 25th. And it's an exhibition mainly of works from the Getty collection, but it also includes 6 drawings kindly lent by Katrin, which tell stories within the show that we wouldn't be able to tell otherwise. And you'll see in the, you will see in the middle of the room there that we have a drawing table where guests and visitors can make their own sketches and learn to draw in their own way. And we also have just outside here, outside the gallery, a wall where people can hang their work. And it's been so impressive to see the imagination and creativity of people in sketching in the galleries. And we have about, every day there are about like 80 or so drawings on the wall there. And it's really just, magnificent. So just a little background to the exhibition before we get started. It really came about because Casey Lee, my co-curator, and I realized that across all the different art academies in Europe, in Italy, France, the Netherlands, Germany, that there was often, for centuries, there's been basically the same element of instruction. So the same recommendations for how to start drawing and how to get into drawing. And generally the progression was this, that you would begin with by studying prints or drawings. And we have a lovely sketch here from the exhibition by Anna Katerina Rugendas, a copy of a print, which you also see on the screen. And she's put this lovely calligraphic inscription in the cartouche that tells us that she was 14 years old at the time she made this. She was from an artistic family, and it's the sort of practice drawing that generally is lost, but perhaps because of this inscription, it survives, and we're thrilled to have it in the collection and exhibition. And I should just say that JPGM stands for J. Paul Getty Museum. And I should also say we are nothing to do with Getty Images, because people do often confuse us that way. And then once artists had learned to draw by copying 2-dimensional works, so prints, drawings, and paintings, then the recommendation was that they would move on to sculpture, as shown here in this 1595 drawing by Federico Zuccaro, showing his older brother Taddeo sketching in the Belvedere courtyard. And you can see the Laocoon sculpture on the right, Belvedere on left. And, the time in Rome was considered to be valuable to learn to draw. And then finally, once you could do that, you were allowed to move on to life drawing, which was considered the summit of this sort of artistic education as the academies saw it. But but obviously in the exhibition, we're trying to tell different stories as well. And we'll come into some elements of that in the panel today. But first, I'd love to ask our panelists, each in turn, essentially what drew them to drawing and how they came to be involved with drawing. Katrin, perhaps you'd like to kick off, please.
Well, as you said, I was a dealer in old master drawings, and I was always drawn more to works on paper than paintings, because I felt in a drawing you can really see the handwriting of the artist, the hand of the artist, and the thinking process, how he works something out. For me, much as I love paintings, I felt that was often hidden under, layers of paint, varnish, restoration. So I always thought drawings give me a much more direct access to an artist.
Yeah. And Anne?
Well, I have to credit my parents, I think, with my interest in drawing, because my father was a very good amateur draftsman and watercolorist, and my mother loved art and was very appreciative of art. And both of those things, I think, contributed to my interest in art and interest in drawing. And I learned to draw from my father, who taught me, not the academic method that you'll be discussing, but we would do still lives and things like that. And I remember being a studio minor in college and a history major. And I just felt, and I kept putting off the art history requirement that all studio people had to take, because everyone would say, oh, you don't want to do that. You've got so many slides. You have to memorize all these images. It's terrible. Anyway, I took my first art history class and loved it. And it was this, this coming together of two things I loved, art and art history. And it was really drawing that led me to being an art historian in the long run. So drawings always have interested me. I've always loved to do it. I've always enjoyed looking at drawings. And so I think that's how it all happened.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always so interesting to me how people get to it, and it is just so engaging, and it is something that becomes a lifetime passion. And Harry, could you tell us how you got into it?
Yeah, so I think just as a small, a child, I was always drawn to drawing because you could sort of make a world or something concrete. You could take it from your imagination and put it onto a page, so a person or a story. And I think there's a real magic in that. And I think I also realized that the act of doing it sort of made stories or that imagination go further. So in a sense, it was a sort of creative engine. As soon as you start doing it, more ideas start to come. And I think the last thing is that I'm quite dyslexic, and at school, it was much easier for me to be in the art room than writing and maths and language. So in a sense, I was sort of drawn to it because it was easier and I could communicate more easily. And then I think the last thing is when you make something and someone says, "Oh, that's nice," and you see them sort of, you see that emotion from something you've made. I think as a child, there's a sort of spark there that is quite addictive.
And do you find you draw a lot now, Harry, as part of your practice?
I'm a bit lapsed, but I do draw a lot, and I often do it to think things through, to think things. I can't speak, sorry. To think things through and to sort of relax. Really, it's a bit more sort of recreational now.
Yeah, I'm always rather embarrassed because people ask me if I can draw, and I'm curator of drawings, and I try regularly, and it's a sort of exercise in humiliation, but it always makes me really appreciate the drawings that I do see, I must say. And you learn something every single time. And I love nothing more than looking at drawings with artists. Like actually looking at drawings with anyone is always, exciting. Like you always learn something new, but particularly with artists, you get just very different takes on things, which is wonderful. And nothing makes me happier than to see people sketching in the galleries too, and just to being inspired and having a go. It's sort of brave and wonderful, I must say. So I had a question for each of you about different aspects, and then we can get into other things and try and talk through some aspects of drawing sort of then and now. Let's see if I can move on. Yeah, so Katrin, I'd love to ask you in particular, you've built up since the 1980s, you've been collecting, in particular drawings, but works of art of artists at work, and built this collection, about 1,800 images of artists sketching or working or drawing, and it's really the most incredible collection. And I'm just so curious how sort of, I guess, how that began, but also how you sort of frame the collection. And every time I see an auction catalog with an image of an artist at work, I immediately think of you. But obviously, you can't buy everything, and you have to prioritize. So how does the collection work for you, and what insights do you feel it yields?
Well, it started, I started in a modest way to collect drawings, which I then, to buy more things, I had to sell some, so I ended up dealing. But when I was dealing, I kind of felt it's such a shame not to keep anything. But of course, as a dealer, it's a conflict of interest. Yeah. And so I started buying drawings of the subject. And I think it happened because in my youth, I wanted to be an artist. I went to art school. School, I don't think, Pratt Institute in New York, which was next to the Morgan Library. And to practice, I went and looked at drawings at the Morgan Library and very quickly realized my limited talent, but discovered old master drawings in the process. And I think it was that attraction to, looking over the artist's shoulder, kind of the mystery, how do they do it, which I clearly didn't managed to do. And I think that's why, it started with a handful of drawings of the subject. My, clients and friends quickly knew this is something I collected for myself. And you can find a modest drawing interesting in the subject, and then, later, added more important drawings. But for example, the drawing we're looking at, I find it so interesting. Clearly, there's someone looking at people drawing. I think it's a, kind of private gathering of people drawing. I think the intriguing thing is you don't know what they're drawing, but the person sketching them, I think he captures the different personalities so well, how they're bent over their boards and some propping their feet up on a bench. And I find this insight into, how does that work of art come into being? I always find really fascinating, and it's a subject I've never gotten bored of, because the danger of collecting a subject is that it gets repetitive. But there's so many different aspects to it that even with almost 2,000 works, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, no, I love this Le Prince drawing. I must say it is. I always feel like like they're all studying you, the viewer, basically, because presumably Le Prince is sat next to the model or close to and so they're all arranged, and they're all, mostly heads down, but feels like you're the subject. And all wash, which is extraordinary too, and very notable for the fact that it has men and women drawing together, which of course for so many centuries wasn't allowed. Basically, wasn't possible. And then Anne, I'd just like to, I brought up this image of the Ackerman's shop and dealer. And, obviously your book, which, it's rather embarrassing for us, but, it's called Learning to Draw. Like, you wrote the book, but Learning to Draw, Studies in the Cultural History of a Polite and Useful Art. And in particular, one of the things you show among many within the book is the sort of shift from very much sort of male studios to women's interest in drawing, and the way that women artists began to come to the fore in the 18th and 19th centuries. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. I think a number of things come into play that accounts for this transition from a masculine pastime to a popular pastime, particularly for women. And that really comes about in the mid 18th century, the 1760s is when it really seems to come into focus. And part of it has to do with a thriving commercial economy, which expands the middle class. And that means that more women of the middle class have a lot of leisure time. And I'd say the second thing that has a role to play is the role of public exhibitions of art in London and elsewhere. But particularly the Royal Academy's annual exhibition in the spring drew great crowds, and it made art a popular pastime. To go to these events, these were conceived of as fashionable entertainment, and people would pay their shilling and go in and look. And it also meant that art was becoming commodified in a way in which it hadn't been before. And it meant too that you have really an artist becoming not a major celebrity, but something almost like a celebrity. People would say, oh, there's Sir Joshua Reynolds, you know. So that gives art a kind of prestige and kind of visibility that it didn't have before. And then I think another development is developments in printmaking, where you get these new techniques like aquatint, which can imitate the look of a wash drawing, or soft ground etching, which can look like a chalk drawing, or later in the early 19th century lithography, which is really just a drawing on stone and then being reproduced. So you get these printmaking techniques that provide booksellers with sophisticated methods to illustrate books on how to draw. And their audience, as I think this little image of Ackerman's repository of the art shows, are women for the most part. You see two ladies at the counter. One is they're perusing objects, you know, it could be brushes. There's a watercolor box opened on the counter. You see them going through portfolios of drawings and prints, and you were allowed to either buy them to imitate them, to take them home and copy them, or you could rent them. And lots of artists would prepare drawings or watercolors to be given out to people to rent, to take home and return to Ackerman's. And you can see a man over there looking at a plaster bust, you know, and you could buy these things. And all of these art supplies were being sold throughout London. I mean, Ackerman's was one of many of these shops. Ackerman's was right on the Strand, just down from Somerset House, where the Royal Academy was. And so it was in that world of supposedly the art world. And so you get these booksellers like Ackerman targeting women in a relentless way, telling them how this is a polite art, how they can beautify their homes, how they can give their beautiful artwork to their family and friends, and how appreciated it will be. And I mean, the appeal to women is relentless. You get titles of drawing manuals, every lady her own drawing master. In other words, you don't need a drawing master, you just need a good manual, and you can do it. And so it's, you know, the beginning of the how-to or do-it-yourself sort of movement almost. And, you know, finally, I mean, there's even an appeal to patriotism, where during the wars with France, Ackerman, in one of his Ackerman's new drawing book, about 1808, links the names of Turner and Girton with the amateur efforts of our lovely countrywomen, you know, in this really hallucinatory patriotic vision of British artistic progress. You know, arm in arm, the professional and the amateur are going to make Britain, you know, a kind of art center in a way it never had been before. And there's that whole idea of artistic progress that drives through this whole commodification of art supplies, artists, and marketing of all of this to women. So anyway, I think that sort of, those things really account for this tremendous shift that you see.
Yeah, no, whenever if I, you know, watch something, Jane Austen, or, you know, it's always drawing or watercolor is somehow prominent. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, she's wonderful. If you want to know what's going on in the middle classes, Jane Austen is a wonderful guide. Yeah.
And I had this other slide. If we can, there we are. Of by Francesco Bartolozzi from Katrin's collection.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful image because it's from a drawing book. And it's an engraving by Bartolozzi of a woman drawing, copying a life drawing, which you see sort of vaguely there in the background, because women at this time were not really allowed to draw from life. That was considered to be, an affront to their modesty. And so you have women learning to do this by copying the drawings made by men in life classes. And that's what you see going on here. And Bartolozzi had lots and lots of pupils, female pupils. He knew many women artists, professional artists, like Angelica Kaufman, who was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy, but he knew a lot of amateur artists too, rather well-placed ones, Lady Beauclerk and Lady Templeton and many people like that. But he also had many middle-class women learning to draw from him. And so this is an interesting image, I think. It's kind of a wonderful image to look at and to think about, in terms of it's an image in a drawing book, encouraging women to use that drawing book to master the images in it, which are mostly images of old master drawings. And, so it's kind of, I like it. It's a wonderful drawing.
Yeah, thank you. And I see that we have a question that is probably good to answer just now. And during this area, what drawing materials were most popular with these middle-class amateurs?
Well, I would say chalk and pencil or graphite. But very quickly, once watercolor becomes more portable and less formidable in terms of a method, watercolor very quickly is picked up by female amateurs. And I would say that's the beginning of the 19th century. And it becomes then one of these media that gets associated with women. And my friend, who's also written about this, Diane Kritz, talks about how the fact that women take over the practice of watercolor means that watercolor drops in prestige among male artists. Even though you have these fabulous watercolor artists like Turner and Girton and Cotman and all of them, there's this way in which it's just not quite as important as oil painting. And the thought is partly because it's feminized. It's thought to be a sort of feminine, media. So.
Thank you. And Harry, I'd like to move on to you. When I visited the Royal Drawing School in the summer, I was so impressed to see, obviously, sort of life classes going on, but also the digital studio that the Royal Drawing School runs. And it just, in terms of traditional drawing skills then and now, I feel it has, it plays a real role in that. And I show here, I don't know if you'd like to start off with this Tiepolo sketch or move straight to the next slide.
I don't know if Katrin wants to. Katrin always talks about this drawing so beautifully. I mean, I love this Tiepolo, but Katrin, I don't know if you want to say something about it from your.
I think it's an interesting case. Be interesting to see how much stayed the same about life drawing and how much has changed. And what I like about this drawing, that is so accurately showing us what an private academy in Venice looked like in 1714. And you still have the life model posing, finding a comfortable position so they can hold the pose. You have the hourglass so that the artist know how long he's going to hold the pose, the crumpled clothes in the corner. And then I find, everybody sitting there, it really looks as if he's portraying certain artists. And some have been identified, the drawing master quite severely standing on the right. And, then the kind of corrector who's using a stylus, correcting a drawing. Then we think there's Tiepolo sitting near the corner. There's Piazzetta, who's not drawing, who's the head. So I find that so fascinating that all these centuries later, we can still see how it was done. They blocked off the light. The window is blocked. There's a light from the top, but there's also individual lights. And you have the rope hanging from the ceiling, so an artist could rest their arm if they had to hold a post with an arm raised. And then on the left, you have actually visitors coming to watch the artist working. So I wonder whether you still have that today, that you allow visitors in.
There's too many safeguarding rules now with the models.
Yes.
I think many of those things still exist. I mean, we always have problems with our tutors forgetting how long the poses are, and the models complaining and things like that. So we should maybe go back to egg timers. But I think, well, Julian, I mean, the next slide I think is a picture of our studios in London. And although there's more easels and people are standing, there's so much that's very similar. But I think, and probably what I'm about to say is completely wrong, but I think what I was taught about I find interesting is why the sort of life room came about, or why figure drawing came about. And what I was always told, that it sort of came from maybe Byzantine times or the Renaissance, where there was a sense that you had to sort of stabilize variation, so everyone was drawing the same, and there was a sort of religious reason for that, because the images and the types of work that was being made and put into churches had to be the same or had to look the same. And then into the Renaissance, where there were workshops like Raphael or Verrocchio or Da Vinci, who was in Verrocchio's studio, I think. There was a sort of commercial aspect to it, where Raphael would get commissions and he would have his workshop, and everyone had to sort of draw the same, if you like. They had to be able to draw like Raphael and paint like him. And the sort of sense of a workshop drawing from figures so that everyone was the same sort of grew, I think, from that. And there was a sort of directive of what was right and wrong. The idea that something could be correct, and the sort of plumb lines and different methods and sight size, where you sort of draw the figure at exactly the right size on your page, as you can see. And I think one of the reasons for that is we're so finely tuned as humans to see inaccuracies in a figure, and particularly a figure drawing. I mean, in a landscape, you can just sort of make it up, and no one ever knows what a tree likes. But the human mind can see in a figure what's right and wrong. So I think those sort of academic and skills-based methods allowed people to get that sort of correctness, and that sort of commercial engine, if you like, from the Renaissance then sort of got taken into institutions and academies and universities. Is that sort of right enough as a potted history?
I think it is. It's excellent.
But I think then things like modernism, postmodernism came along, and we used to start to ask, why is it still relevant? But I love that quote, which is sort of is interesting, from Picasso, where the quote is, it took me 4 years to learn how to draw like Raphael, and a lifetime to learn how to draw like a child. Maybe I might have butchered that, but it's this idea that he learned it all and then he sort of had to unlearn it, or break the rules. And we get asked a lot by our postgraduate students, and this is our postgraduate students here, why should we draw from life? Why should we learn? And it's a very artificial environment, isn't it? And a lot of these students are actually performance artists or sculptors or conceptual artists, but they come to the drawing school because they believe that there's something important about it. And for me, and I think what a lot of them would say, is that looking hard and drawing, it's about attention. It sort of changes the way you see the world. And it's also about embodiment. There's this idea that you're making something that's analog, and you're connecting with the world in a slightly different way. So we often talk about the life room being a bit like a laboratory or a gym where you're training. You're sort of training, but all those sort of rules have sort of been lost, or we think about them, but they've sort of been sort of adapted, and it's become a bit more imaginative. And actually, our artistic director said something last week at a meeting, and talking about exactly this: why draw? Why really observe the world? And she said, Being a good artist is like being a really good comedian. You have to really observe the world as a comedian, because then when the jokes you tell are funny because they're observed and people can relate to them. And she said that's what she thinks life drawing is a bit like. The more you look and the more you learn, the more, real it is. But sorry, I'm going on too much. But we've also got our digital studio, which is the next slide, which is where we use cameras and then broadcast in a very similar way to we are today. But we don't think we can replace the optical weirdness of the real world with it. But it is a way of bringing people together and going through some of the different rules. And there's something so lovely about it in terms of community and reaching people around the world and accessibility. But we also try to do things that you can't do in real life. So you can see on the left, the model's face has been turned black and white. So you can talk about sort of tonal considerations, which you can't really do in real life. And sometimes we turn the model upside down. And if you go on to the final slide that I've got, Julian, you'll see another image where there's 3 models. So actually what you can't see in this is that the model is moving. So one of those models is moving, but we've frozen the 2 images of the model. And so you can sort of start to play around with sort of digital techniques that sort of start to think about the life room in a slightly different way. And if you look carefully, the figure on the right sort of slightly looks like she's floating, and that's because we've sort of cut her out and put her there. And then the figure in the middle is actually dancing around herself. So there's some quite weird things that you can do. But anyway, I've gone on too long, but that's sort of, yeah.
It's great. It's fascinating. I think, and you talk about community with these sort of online classes, which is a wonderful, it is one of the things with Zoom. Like, on some level I hate it, but on some level I love being able to do things like this and to engage with people in lots of different places and bring a lot of people together. And it's sort of one of the things when I, looking through images of artists at work over time and thinking about how it is now, or with the web or with Zoom classes or whatever, I find myself often wondering, how different it is to draw with other people versus like a solitary drawing. I mean, obviously it can be anything and it can be what you want it to be. And I found it's interesting, the drawing table that we have here in the galleries. A lot of people, they sketch the things they're sketching, but a lot of people sketch other members of their family sketching or something like that. And there is that wonderful sort of communal aspect. I wonder if any of you would like to speak to that, like what you get from to not express it very well, but what you get from the community and what you get from doing it in a solitary capacity. Maybe Anne,
Yeah, I'm interested in both of those things, and the exhibition does a nice job of showing both kinds of experiences. I think solitary drawing for me is almost meditative. It sort of, it's you and the motif or the drawing that you're working on. And it is, the world kind of disappears. But I think when it's a social event, when you're in a class or when you're in you see the 2 women in drawing together, at least one is drawing and the other's looking at her work. There's a sense of community, and there's a sense of, oh, that's how you did it. Yeah, okay. And it's a more of an exchange and a kind of comparison of, the ways in which different people are approaching something that'll be different from you. And it's always interesting to see what it's going to be. So yeah, they both have their advantages. I mean, one is really meditative and quiet and kind of close out the world, and the other is really quite the other extreme. It's really about letting things in and being open yourself to these other ways of doing things. So,
yeah. And Harry, did you have thoughts about that in particular?
I was just thinking that we at the drawing school we have we think of the life room as there's 4 elements to it, and without 4 elements, it doesn't really work. And it's the room itself, and we're lucky that we've got lovely, lovely sort of rooms. It's the model, it's the tutor, and it's the other students. And actually, those 4 things, how they interact, creates the life room and sort of creates a community of learners. And I think we often think about the model at the school as such an important part of it, because they are a human, and they have thoughts in their head, and they are a sort of universe of thoughts, and often that and often talking, we have sessions where each student will ask the model a question, and I think that's very interesting too, that you start to create this sort of dialogue, or sort of you start to understand a person, and that sort of then gets fed into the drawings, which I think is interesting.
There's a nice comment in the Q&A just saying, drawing together is fun socializing. Good artists feel how good they are, and consequence they'll see other good artists give them the ideas to each other. And I think that, and there's a flip side to that too, that you can see how people are starting, and people are, all different levels. And it sort of, I think in a way, gives confidence to individuality. There was a wonderful event I saw recently, actually a Royal Drawing School event with Charlie Mackesy, where he was talking about teaching a class of adults. And he said to them, how many of you, this is like 20 people, how many of you can draw? And like one hand went up. And then he's like, well, how many of you could draw when you were 7? And they all raised their hands. And he's like, so what happened? What happened in between, And it's true. I think we all just get very self-conscious and worried, but to be able to see drawing going on, you just learn something every single time, yeah. And one thing that I'm always been curious about. I mean, nowadays, obviously in the periods that we're talking about, before 1900, and and the drawings that we're looking at now. Basically, if you wanted an image of something, you had to capture it yourself. You had to sketch it. You had to ask somebody else to draw it for you. If you wanted to take it home, if you saw a beautiful sunset, you had to make a watercolor. And now, of course, we just whip our phone out and snap everything. And we talked earlier, Harry, you talked about how, in solitary drawing there is, or maybe Anne, it was this sense of like focus that you get. And that seems to be something that is, that it's just very difficult to get these days, is that sense of study and focus and really giving something time. Time is, the most precious thing we all have. And sometimes it feels like that speeds everything up, but it also feels like it really, when we have time to slow down, we really do get something from it. I don't know if any of you have things to add to that in particular.
Yes, I think.
Sorry,
you go ahead.
No, you go, honestly.
No, I think on a more general thing, I think it's hard to imagine in our age where we're flooded with images, thanks to photography, everybody being a photographer, what it must have been like when images were something very rare. So if you saw a painting or a fresco in a church, it had a huge impact, and you looked very slowly and carefully and tried to understand, to get the story it tells. And now I think everything has to be grasped very quickly, because there's just so much information to take in. And that's why there's a trend for slow looking, because I think that's something we can't really do anymore, because, there is such a, flood of images surrounding us.
Julia, one thing I was going to say, there's something about drawing that can act like a sort of, it can sort of imprint in your memory in a way that photography can't. And there's drawings I made when I was, 12 on holiday in France, and I can still feel the heat and the space, and the being there, and I can still see the drawing and what I was looking at. And I think that there's something about drawing in the way it connects us to the world and connects the world to us, that's very important. And if anyone watching is going on holiday, and they're just going to take a load of photos, I'd really say, you know, take a sketchbook and just do some 5-minute sketches, because you take in the information and what's around you in such an interesting way that that you remember in a different way as well. And I think that goes to the sort of why I believe drawing, and you know, for any reason, is so important still in an age of digital and fast moving things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a very good book called Your Brain on Art, which talks about, you know, the benefits of the arts in general, but, you know, how certainly studies have shown how if you focus on drawing, you know, just in terms of your mental health, it can really just bring a great deal of peace and beyond, you know. We brought up sort of digital tools, and I see there's quite a long question in the Q&A, but about digital tools and the difference between using them and traditional drawing techniques. And obviously we've covered a little bit of that, but I'd be very curious for people that are watching today who have used both traditional drawing techniques and digital tools, the differences that they find between them and what they get from both of those things. I'm going to stop sharing screen too as well, like that. But yeah, there was the comment from Luciana. Yeah, I learned to draw before digital tools, so drawing is still my first language. Most of my students don't draw by hand. As teachers, we can't just project our own habits. We need to meet them where they are. And it is, you know, it's very interesting to see what people get from these different aspects.
Julian, I think just on that one, sorry, I think there's something in a way that doesn't really matter what you're drawing on. You know, we have lots of people who use iPads and things. If you're looking at the world, but I do think there's something about drawings and some of the drawings in your all of your drawings in your exhibition, there's something analog about them, where that marks are made in time, if that makes sense, and they overlay, and the time is held in the drawing, and I think the viewer sees that too. I think the problem with some digital media is that the time disappears because it's flattened by pixels. So I mean, I'm making this up, but my view is that when we respond to the physical sheet that has that mark that's been made by the artist, our brains respond in a slightly different way to the printed digital image that has come out of the process. I think something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Another comment from Katrin. I enjoy both digital drawing and pencil paper drawing. Both expand creativity, only the tools are different. Yeah, I mean, I often think about it as a museum person, like what's the difference between, you know, looking at a drawing in the gallery, the unique object, and a reproduction on a screen, you know, onto which you can zoom in, you know, to an amazing degree often. And I think it's very, you know, sometimes what one misses is the physicality of the paper, the sense of, you know, pencil scratching over the paper, and that sense of, in a way, of being there, and of the fact it is a single unique object, you know, a fragile piece of paper that's been preserved by people for hundreds of years, you know, and there is something magical about that very fact. Yeah.
Julian, Katrin showed me her drawings collection not that long ago, and there is, I mean, the magic of opening a box and then pulling out those drawings is pretty special. And yeah, anyway, it just reminded me of that as you were saying that, and the Tiepolo was one of the drawings, and it's so different to flicking through a slideshow. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, but having said that, you know, it is amazingly useful to have the images from museums, you know, in terms of comparing things and this and that, you know. But it's one thing I find is often when we photograph things here, you know, to put them on the web, how difficult it is to get the color or to get things looking actually even close to what they are, it's certainly tricky. So I think, I mean, if there are particular questions people have, I'm sure we could all, between us, we can try and answer them. Let me have a look. The question, I'm curious about the accessibility of figural sculpture versus figural drawing instruction for women and amateurs in the 18th and 19th centuries. Anne, would you like to have a...
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed just read it again, Julie.
So you'll see it maybe at the bottom of the question and answer panel. But I'm curious about the accessibility of figural sculpture versus figural drawing instruction for women and amateurs in the 18th and 19th centuries.
I don't know that there was a big difference. I mean, sculpture, I mean, these casts were ubiquitous. They were all overdrawing schools. You see them, sometimes in people's houses. The thing is, they're big and they're a little cumbersome. Small etchings, engravings, soft ground, all of those things are portable. They're less expensive. They have a kind of accessibility, I think, for amateurs that something like a sculpture might not have. So that would be my sort of quick answer.
Yeah, thank you. And another question. As a beginner, what is best to draw or a book? Oh, it maybe needs some clarification. Anyway. And then question for Katrin. Katrin, what's the drawing behind you, the triptych? It's gorgeous. Whose work is it?
It's a Japanese artist, and it's an enormous drawing of, actually, it's a parking lot, and they're all weeds, and extraordinarily it fit the space exactly. Now I have to look up the name of the artist, which I hopefully have at hand somewhere. And I have quite a few of her drawings, but none of them at this scale, and they're always weeds. And the artist is called Yukiko Suto, and it's called Late Autumn Weeds, and it's from 2019. Here you go.
The joy of live Zoom in people's homes right now. Here we are. Yeah. And then I think a question probably for you, Harry, maybe. I mean, or from Fernanda. You talked about how similar the process of learning how to draw still is compared to the 1700s. What would you say differs now other than the digital aspects? Do you find the academic approach has changed at all?
I mean, well, for us, the life rooms become extremely varied in what people are teaching and learning. So if you came to the Royal Drawing School, we have 4 studios that are operating every day for 6 hours. And one studio, you might have a very traditional appearing anatomy lesson with people really trying to understand what was going on and lots of measuring. But then the next studio, there might be drawing a story with a tutor reading a myth from, a Greek myth, and then the model arranged in a way that would allow them to respond to the story and the model at the same time. And then in another studio, you might have a course like the drawing lab where there's no model and everyone is just, the tutor might say, right, everyone draw a bike. And everyone draws a bike, and then you pin all the bikes on the wall, and the tutor goes, look, everyone's bike is going from right to left, except for that one. What does that say about the way we experience the world? So it's much more conceptual. And then there might be a portrait class. So there's a real mixture of different approaches. And I think the big difference, I think, is that the individual artists themselves, the inner world of the artist, is much more present in the contemporary life room. And although people are observing the model in a very intense way, what comes out isn't, everyone does not look the same. Everyone is interpreting differently and bringing themselves to their responses, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then Daphne kindly clarified the question. As a beginner, what should I draw? Or what book would you recommend? Harry, I guess, again. I mean,
I
just start anywhere, really. I would.
Yeah, anywhere. Yeah, draw anything. I think anything that interests you, and I think the other thing says that nothing's too difficult, actually. And anyway, yeah, I think anything. Yeah.
And there
Sorry,
are,
I'm not very good answer. Sorry.
talking about digital things. I mean, there are YouTube tutorials as well for drawing pretty much anything. That can be a good place to start with just one, a particular something that appeals to you, or, yeah.
But someone mentioned
sorry, Katrin.
in the chats or in the question that there's the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is an interesting approach and a certain technique. I don't know whether that's something you use, Harry, but I thought it was
it's a really good book because there's a really great start to it where it talks about moving from being a child and what we were saying earlier about, I think it was Anne, you were saying, and it was you, Julian, about the everyone said they could draw when they were 7, but then not when they're an adult. And there's a great chapter in the book about why that happens and why we become self-conscious and sort of freeing yourself up again. It's a great book. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love in that book is that if you're going to copy a drawing, turn it upside down and then copy it, because it cuts your brain out. And what you're doing is training yourself to really see without having your brain take over and say, oh, no, this is the way you do an eye, or this is the way you do this or that. No, you put that on hold for a while and you just look at what's there. And one of the ways to do that is, as she says, is to turn the drawing upside down and then copy. And it makes a huge difference. So, it was an exercise that really stuck with me, because I thought, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. And I think copying other artists' work, other artists' drawings, is something we probably don't do much of anymore. But it actually is a wonderful way to train your hand and your eye. It's something that I think maybe has fallen out of practice.
And it's actually in our curriculum, we have the whole drawing from art section, and we run courses in the National Gallery, and I think what it does is it allows you. I mean, when I was a student at the drawing school, I sat in front of the same Veronese painting, actually, the big one of Alexander the Great. I can't remember, Darius, the very big one, and drew it for 5 days, so 6 hours a day for 5 days, and you sort of learn. Because there's all the art history about it and everything but you sort of learn about the way it's the rhythms and the way it's constructed in a very interesting way. And at the end of it, after 5 days of really painstaking drawing, we all sort of congregated at the end, and the tutor just said, "Right, rub it out." I was like, "What?" We said, "Well, what are you going to do with it? It's somebody else's." But there was something about the sort of. I think he was being challenging, but there's something about sort of why not rub it out? What's the you put all that work, but anyway, I didn't rub it out.
And I see there's a question, the line between drawing and painting. If a drawing is in color, using, say, watercolor, what makes it a painting and not a drawing? Is there a clear distinction? And this is something actually we get a lot of in the museum, because when we show watercolors, they're like, well, why are these drawings? Why aren't they paintings? And it's, it is a sort of a moot point, but of course, in the end, the support is paper, generally. And so that's why they're lumped in with drawings. And, one could argue that obviously a lot of historic drawings that have pen and ink and wash, the wash is essentially a sort of watercolor. So there's really not so much crossover. And I think in general, it's not a distinction that, existed so much in the past. It came into being more in the 18th and 19th centuries.
But then you have pastels, and pastels on paper, but because they're finished like a painting, some museums keep them in their paintings departments, like the Louvre, even though they're never on view. And others keep them because they're on paper and drawings department. So I think there is
Mhm.
you know, it's a different in between. And I was going to ask you, Anne, so you said earlier that watercolor became associated with a very feminine medium and therefore was less prestigious. Did something similar happen to pastel? Because I know pastel became very popular with women artists
Um,
in the 18th century.
I don't know. I mean, I do know about watercolor because it just happens, and by the early 19th century, it's suddenly not as important. And for a while there, it looked like Britain was going, you talk about the progress of the arts, it looked like Britain was going to, be the great capital of watercolor. And then it just sort of falls apart. Pastel, I don't know, because, in Britain anyway, pastel was not quite what it was in France or some of the other countries. And so it never quite had that popularity or prestige that watercolor had. So I'm not quite sure about pastel.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with pastel, it came to, in the explosion of pastel in the sort of 18th century,
Yeah.
it was partly because, it was there were fewer sort of barriers to entry, so to speak. So women, like you didn't need to have a big studio. You could do,
Right.
it was something you could do in a smaller space. The materials themselves were so much more portable,
Right.
paper and sticks as opposed to,
Yeah.
huge canvases or whatever. And that
Yeah.
definitely played a part as it evolved as well.
And I
Um,
know, yeah, and that's a big part of what happens with watercolor. Watercolor becomes more portable when you start getting blocks of color, cakes of color, and then of course tubes of color. But and the drawing booksellers make the point that it doesn't smell. There's no turpentine. There's no oil paint. It's clean, and you can do it and clean up in no time. And I think something like that must have also been, a selling point for pastel before watercolor became, more easy to manipulate. So.
yeah. Yeah, and they are, as Katrin, as they are things that it just depends on the department. I mean, here at the Getty, they're in the drawings department because, again, generally they're on paper or vellum.
Yeah.
But for a long time, they were existing in the paintings department and the drawings department, and it was very confusing for everyone. But we're very proud of our pastel collection and always like to keep some on view.
Mhm.
And I would just say while we're at it too, that we here at the Getty, we have the exhibition currently, Learning to Draw, but anything in our collection, any of the drawings in our collection that aren't on display in the galleries are available to view by anyone here in the study room at the Getty by appointment. One can just email drawings@getty.edu. And we're very proud of that. So I think we'll have to wrap up very shortly. I'm looking at the questions. There are lots of good questions and lots of things we'd love to get our teeth into. Let me just think. For Katrin, do you know of prominent artists working now in pastel? I'm trying to think.
Yes, I think if I'm not mistaken, Harry, then Catherine Goodman works in pastel very beautifully, and then of course Paula Rigo, and but pastel was associated again as being feminine, powdery, not as messy as oil painting. But then Paula Rigo said this famous thing: "No, a brush is much too soft for me. I need a pastel stick to attack the paper." And if you look at her pastels, they're so strong and so that you wouldn't, at first sight, you wouldn't think that they're actually pastel and a drawing. So yes, I think pastel is still very much a medium that's being used, but maybe in very different ways than. What would you say, Harry? Is it still a popular medium?
I don't think it's. I mean, the Paula Rego, she used the Conte. I think because even the soft pastels were too soft because she usually says she with violence to the. And when you see them, I think when you see those ones that are on aluminium, they do appear like they do feel like paintings, don't they? At first, sort of look. Christina Kamezi, who's an artist who's doing well at the moment, she uses pastels on suede actually, which is probably a a nightmare for any conservators, but that she's using it. I think I mean, I was thinking about the methods that are used, and actually, it's expanded so much. I mean, we have students who are sewing and using all sorts of different methods and expanding what drawing might be, which is, I think, great and interesting. And I think for us at the drawing school, it's just about that sort of observational. Even if you're observing your own imagination, there's something about that dialogue which is interesting, and the mark you make.
And then Chantal Joffe is another artist, contemporary artist. She uses pastel. She says to herself, I had a Degas phase, where she looks at Degas and his use of pastel. And of course, he's one of the great artists to use pastel in the 19th century.
So we're at noon, I'm afraid, and we'll have to wrap it up. And I'm so sorry that there are a bunch of questions that I would have liked us to get to that we haven't been able to get to. Now, I think we can perhaps try and answer some after the Zoom. But again, thank you all so much for attending, and thank you so much to Katrin and Anne and Harry for being a part of this. And it's really just been, yeah, I find it fascinating. And thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.